Welcome to Stitch in Time. My name is Michael Llanos, and it's my mission to make sewing approachable to the hobbyist. In this video, we're going to go over 3 different types of seams. Before we do any stitching, we always go to the ironing board first. Meet you over there. Well, that didn't work. Let's try that again. Much better. Now the cloth I'm using today has 2 clear sides to it. It has a front side or a right side, and it has a back side or the wrong side. And when you're ironing, I always recommend that this front side or right side is face down. That way the heat goes to the back side, and if any damage happens, which I hope it doesn't, it will happen to the back side and will not be visible on the garment. Now, as you can see, I have a towel that's placed down. This helps with the ironing process. Now, when you're ironing, you don't want to stretch the cloth at all. You just want to lay it flat, and you want to steam it with the iron on top. You don't want to slide the cloth around. You just want to use the weight of the iron in pressing the cloth. Since we're doing 3 seams, we have 6 pieces of cloth, so let me get through the other 5. Now that we're done pressing, let's head back to the sewing machine. Not again. And we're back. Now that we're at our machine, let's start with our first seam. Our first seam is called a simple seam. Let me give you a close-up view so you can see what I'm doing with the cloth and with the machine. Now for a simple seam, you want to make sure the right sides, or the 2 good sides, are facing each other. You want to line up the edge where the seam is going to be. Seam is where you attach the 2 pieces of fabric. This one lines up the best on this side. So for a simple seam, you want to just take 1 stitch line and stitch all the way down the edge. And that's it. That's why it's a simple seam. It's simple. First, I like to pin my cloth. There are some pro sewers out there that don't need to even pin. I think it's bogus. I think they're way too talented. I'm a very simple person. I pin to make sure I get it right. You don't need to pin 100 pins, maybe a few or 4 or something like that. It's good just to make sure your cloth is staying where it's supposed to be staying. Often when I'm pinning, I pin from the outside edge of the cloth into the cloth. That way, as I'm sewing along, it's very easy to pull the pins out this way. Another thing I do when I'm pinning is I make sure to eyeball. I'm used to seeing a lot of sewing, so I know where the 5/8 line is, and I try and pin on the outside of that line. In the off chance that a pin does tear at the cloth or the fibers a little bit, it will be on the inside of the garment and nobody will see it if that's the case. So the first step is you line up this edge of the fabric on your 5/8 line on your sewing machine. Then you put the presser foot down and you twist this knob towards you, always towards you, and the needle goes right into the cloth. I make sure these go to the back a little bit, and you go forward a couple of stitches. 1, 2, and then there's a knob right here on the front side of my machine that if you hold it down, it allows you to backstitch. And then you go backwards a couple of stitches. 1, 2. And what that does is it locks in the thread so that it doesn't tear out easily. Then you just make sure to keep this edge right along that 5/8 line, and you just nice and slowly stitch along. Especially if this is your first time, I would make sure to go slowly. Now I'm getting really near to my pin, so what do? I make sure I twist this knob until the needle is into the cloth. That way I can easily remove the pin and nothing moves around. When the needle is up, even sometimes when the presser foot is down, the cloth can shift and adjust, and then you got a crooked seam. So you just continue going. I often put my finger on this side a little bit once I have it outside of the machine, not necessarily to pull the cloth through, but just to give a little bit of pressure and making sure it's feeding through the machine nice and straight. So again, going nice and slowly, especially if this is your first time. My finger is on the seam and giving just slight pressure as I'm going through the machine. I'm coming up to another needle, another pin I mean. Pull the pin out. See how easy that is when it's on the side like that, and you keep going all the way to the end. Now when you get to the end, you want to get pretty close, not all the way to the edge, but pretty close. And then you want to do another locking stitch, where you back stitch and forward stitch, again just to lock the fabric. Then you pull the needle up, presser foot comes up. My machine, you may want to look out for this, your machine may have it. I have a little thread cutter here which you can use, or you can use snips. Right now for this simple seam I'm going to use the thread cutter in the machine. So here we are, we have the white, it's pretty hard to see with the bright light, there's a white seam on the edge. Now we're not done yet with this seam. It's simple, but there's the ironing step. So back to the ironing board. Now that we're back at the ironing board, your seam is sewn. The next step is to meld the stitches, they call it, where you run the iron over the stitch points and make sure they lock into the fabric. While you're at it, just give the whole thing a little iron. This is the point. Once I know the seam is good and locked in, that's when I choose to clip the ends of the seams to make sure there are no little hanging frays from the stitches. I clip them as close as I can. Because you did those back stitches, they're locked in. Then the next step, I open up and I iron, I press the seam to one side first. So I give it a slight little tug, not much. Very slight tug to make sure fabric's taut, and that your seam is all to one side. Then the main side should look like that. The next step is I open the seam and then I go right down the center to make sure the seam lays flat. That way, if you happen to wear this, it doesn't pop out. There's your simple seam, all done. Now that we're back at the machine, the second seam we're going to go over is a flat felled seam. Flat felled seam is a little more complicated than the simple seam. Many people know it as the seam that's in Levi jeans on the inside of the legs. So our first step would be to start with a simple seam. So you already know how to do that. Couple pins. And just a straight line down the sewing machine. Make sure the threads are under the presser foot and to the back. Couple stitches back. Then you make sure to lock the stitch in at the end, like the regular simple seam, and you're good. Now we have our simple seam, as you can see. Now for a flat felled seam, what's going to need to happen is one of these little flaps has to be cut down, and then the longer flap gets rolled over it and stitched a second time. But first, we have to hit the iron. Now that we're done the first part of the flat felled seam, which is essentially just a simple seam, we have to meld the stitches. So you iron over them to lock them in. While your iron's hot and you're at it, just give the whole thing a press. And again, now is the time where I clip right to the edge, as close as I can on these little ends. And since your stitches are locked in, there's no reason for it to fray. The next step is I open this up and I press the seam to one side. Now, that way that prepares me to be able to cut this top little seam allowance. Since we sewed this to 5/8 of an inch, I would cut that in half for the flat felled seam. So you take the top one, cut it right in half. That's where these little snips come in real handy. You don't want to cut the bottom one, just the top one. Sometimes I flip it over because it'll make it easier to grab that edge. You want to go in the middle, so that way you can grab only the top one to cut. There you are. And then what you do is you roll this top piece over to the seam. I give that a nice good press. From the other side, I roll this over to the seam. Give it a nice good press. When that's rolled in, then you take the whole chunk of it, press it over. And you do your final press. Then the next step is over at the sewing machine for the last stitch. Now that we're back at the machine for the flat felled seam, you want to make sure that the rolled over bit, I like it rolled over that way when I sew. You can choose your own preference. And then you want to stitch just along the edge of the ridge in that fold. Put the needle down. You do a couple of forward stitches, a couple of backward stitches to lock it, and then away we go. Like the end of any seam, you want to get to the edge, back stitch a couple, forward stitch a couple, and you're good to go because it's locked up. Cut the thread, and all you need are the finishing touches back at the ironing board. For your flat felled seam, you want to once again meld your stitches. Just to lock that in. Make sure to clip your ends. And there you go. Flat felled seam finished. Now that we're back at the machine, we're working on the French seam. A French seam, you actually have to start backwards. So instead of starting with the wrong sides facing out, right sides facing in, you want to do the opposite. So you want the best side forward. These two edges are the best edges. You want to line up your edges, pin them, and you start with a simple seam, but you start with a smaller seam allowance. Again, your seam allowance is your edge in. So instead of doing 5/8 of a seam allowance, you need to do 3/8 for your first stitch. Three-eighths for me, it's right at the edge of the presser foot. So I make sure my thread is going back. Presser foot down. Needle in the cloth. A couple of stitches forward. A couple of stitches back to lock it in. And then away we go. Now that we're at the edge, again, you do the back stitch to lock, and then you're done with that first section. See how the right sides are together? Now back to the iron. Now that we're at our ironing board for our French seam, at the beginning of the video I mentioned that you want to always make sure to iron on the wrong side. This is an exception to the rule. You can't meld the stitches from the wrong side. It's not possible. So I just get the edge as close as I can. I try not to go over too much. Make sure to meld those stitches. Once they're melded, clip the ends. And with the French seam, you want to clean up this edge a little bit. So I cut just a little bit off, maybe in half. And then from the other side to catch it. Then, once you've cut and cleaned that edge up, I open it up and make sure to drag it along the towel a little bit so that the seam tucks under. If you're not good at doing it this way, I would recommend going against my thoughts on ironing the wrong side of the cloth and just grab this top seam to one side. If you're good at doing it this way, I would recommend doing it this way. And then what you want to do is you want to fold it back. Make sure that your seam is right on the edge. Make sure it doesn't roll over. So your seam should be right in that edge. French seams get sloppy when they get rolled over. So you want to make sure they're right on the edge. Now back to the sewing machine. For the French seam, you want to sort of feel where that ridge is on the inside, and you want to be sewing to the left of it. So since we did 3/8 of the original, a lot of seam allowance patterns have 1/4 inch left, or 2/8 if you will. 2/8 plus 3/8 is 5/8, which means I'd be lined up right with the edge of the presser foot on my sewing machine. And the needle goes in, we do a couple of forward stitches, a couple of backward stitches to lock it, and away we go. Once we get to the end, like normal, we do a couple of backward stitches, a couple of forward stitches just to lock it. And we are all set. And now we have no seam coming through. Let's go back to the iron to finish this up. For your French seam, you want to once again meld your stitches. And clip your ends. Then when you open it up, it should look like a simple seam. I would press the remainder of this inside flap to one side to finish it. That way it looks nice and neat. There you go, a French seam. So here are the 3 seams. You have your simple seam. Its benefit is that it's really easy to do and gets you started on your projects and gets them done more quickly. The downside is that these little ends on the inside will end up beginning to fray and your garment won't last quite as long. Flat felled seam is right here. It's very durable. It's difficult to do in some places. It gets really quite tight in certain garments. So it's great for certain parts for durability, but not everywhere maybe. Great seam to know. Here's your French seam. More delicate fabrics like inside of pockets or linings. If you're working with satin or any kind of sheer fabric like that, it's great. These two encase the ends, the fringes of the cloth, and it makes it more durable by encasing them in 2 seams. Thank you for joining me today at Stitch in Time. My name is Michael Lianos, and it's my mission to make sewing approachable to the hobbyist. If this video helped you, please like and subscribe and look at other videos on the channel. Have a great day.